Good afternoon, everyone, or good evening, or good morning, wherever you are. Welcome to another session of Abralin ao Vivo, Linguists Online. I'm Esther Scarpa from the State University of Brazil. Thank you for being here today for another great talk in this fantastic series, masterminded and coordinated by Miguel Oliveira Jr., the president of Brazilian Association of Linguistics. Today is the penultimate day of this Abralin ao Vivo. It's going to be missed, but the talks and commentaries will be available here at YouTube. It's been 3 months filled with excellent presentations and discussions, gathering precious contribution from linguists all over the world, for all ages. In this moment of tension and reclusion, Abralin ao Vivo, Linguists Online is an initiative by the Brazilian Association of Linguists, Abralin, in cooperation with several international associations. Here are some of them. Comité Internacional Permanent de Linguística, Associação de Linguística e Filologia da América Latina, Sociedade Argentina de Estudios Linguísticos, Linguistics Society of America, Societas Linguística Europeia, Linguistics Association of Great Britain, Australian Linguistics Association. I have the pleasure and honor to introduce you to Professor Elizabeth Couper-Kuhlen, Emerita Professor from Helsinki University. The title of her presentation is American English OK Over Time, Challenge and Chance for Interactional Linguistics. Professor Couper-Kuhlen has been doing some groundbreaking, pioneering, and inspirational work that spans nearly 5 decades of teaching and researching. She started her academic career in 1971 and worked in several universities in Germany and Switzerland. And now, last time I think she's still affiliated to the University of Helsinki, being Professor Emerita. She has published extensively and supervised numerous theses and dissertations. And by her own account that I took from the internet, her research over the past 20 years has centered on prosody and the use of language in social interaction. Those fields together have come to be known as interactional linguistics. The idea is to examine language in vivo rather than in vitro, i.e. in real situations of use rather than in the laboratory, and to use the evidence provided by the participants themselves to warrant analytic claims. This approach is currently taking 2 trends. The first concerns affect and emotion as they are displayed and managed in everyday conversational storytelling. The task is to describe the verbal, vocal, and gestural resources used to make effective stances accessible in storytelling and to understand the relevancies that such affect displays mobilize for particular kinds of affiliative response. The second one relates to close combining in talking interaction. Here, the challenge is to understand what are typically thought of as static grammatical constructions, as actions that unfold in time and can therefore dynamically project specific kinds of upcoming talk and or retrospectively backlink to specific parts of earlier talk. Thank you very much, Professor Couper-Kuhlen, for having accepted our invitation. It's an honor to have you here. Now I leave the ground over to you. Sorry, questions will be asked after the talk. Now over to you.
Thank you very much, Esther, for these kind words. I'm honored to be part of this endeavor, even if it is the penultimate day of the program. I'm glad I got in at the very end. I think it's an excellent idea to have this series of lectures, and I think it might be something that would be worth pursuing, even if we are outside of COVID-19 times. I'm going to be, you mentioned two areas of my past research, storytelling and clause combining, but I'm going to be talking about something different today. Namely, I'm going to be talking about a particle, the particle okay, as it's used in American English. So I'm going to switch to my PowerPoint presentation now. Let's see if this is going to work. Here it should be. All right, and right. So my title is American English Okay Over Time, Challenge and Chance for Interactional Linguistics. Before I talk more in detail about the topic, I'd like to give you an overview of what I'll be doing. I'll say something first about the Interactional Linguistics program and what I consider to be one of its challenges. Then I'll talk about the OK project. This was a large-scale cross-linguistic project dealing with OK, and I'll say specifically something about its American English component. Then I will look at the use of OK and how that has changed over time. And fourth, I'll begin to zoom in on a particular type of sequence, informing sequences, and look at the spread of OK in this type of sequence. And finally, I'll come back to the Interactional Linguistic program and say how this type of study can be a chance for the approach to move forward. So let's start with the Interactional Linguistic program. You can find out more about what we mean by interactional linguistics or studying language in social interaction in this book that appeared in 2018 with Margaret Selting. I will kind of summarize now what this approach involves. It is a radically empirical enterprise to the study of language in social interaction. It investigates linguistic phenomena in their natural habitat, which is social interaction. It relies on audio-video recordings of naturally occurring interaction and subjects these recordings to qualitative, inductive microanalysis. It treats language as a set of resources for the accomplishment of tasks within unfolding social encounters. And it asks, I need to go back, it asks how the resources of a given language are deployed to implement social actions and to organize interaction. As for the methodology of interactional linguistics, it is heavily indebted to conversation analysis. It insists that the practices, the linguistic and semiotic practices that are identified by analysts must be shown to be real and relevant for the participants themselves. Its analytic claims must be warranted by reference to the participants and their conduct in the data. And this can be done by examining how a particular turn or a turn design is treated in subsequent talk display, how that displays what participants take prior turns to have been about. This is referred to as next turn proof procedure. This is a strongly inductive approach, and in many ways it is a strength. It is a strength because we no longer need to rely on armchair introspection for understanding language. We no longer rely on, that's curious, on surveys and questionnaires concerning the use of language in imagined situations. Instead, as linguists, we look at what interactants actually say and do in real life. And our claims are based on hard facts as documented in the data. This inductive approach, however, at the same time is also a limitation. This is because the approach is dependent on actual recordings of natural data. And access to language use at earlier periods in time is restricted by the lack of recordings. This means that it is difficult to look at the use of language in interaction diachronically. And this is what I am now calling the challenge of interactional linguistics. Today, I want to present a study that attempts to address the challenge of looking at language diachronically with an interactional linguistic approach. I'm going to be reporting on a study of short-term change in the use of the particle okay in American English. Okay is said to come from American English. It's said to be derived from the phrase all correct and abbreviated as O.K. And this abbreviation is said to have been first used in Boston newspapers in the 1830s. Since then, however, the abbreviation and the word itself has spread to other types of written discourse, to speech, and to other languages. And in fact, it is now said to be one of the most common words in the languages of the world today. The report that I'm going to be presenting is part of a larger cross-linguistic project that deals with okay, the particle okay, in 13 different languages. This cross-linguistic project is about, the results of the project are about to appear in an edited volume by Betts, Depperman, Mondada, and Sorjonen, entitled Okay Across Languages Toward a Comparative Approach to Its Use in Talk and Interaction. I was responsible for the American English component of the OK project, and I'm going to be saying something about the insights that came from my study of OK in American English. How did I proceed? I randomly selected everyday conversations from two different periods in the past. One period that I'm going to refer to as the older period from the 1960s. The data here include many telephone conversations, but also one or two rather grainy video recordings of face-to-face interaction. And then a second set of data from the 1990s and early 2000s, also telephone conversations and video recordings of face-to-face interaction. In selecting the conversations to examine, I tried to make them as varied as possible in terms of participant constellations. So two-party, three-party, multi-party, face-to-face telephone. I manually extracted all of the sequences with the particle okay, the freestanding particle okay, in the selected conversations. And I stopped when I had approximately 100 tokens in each data set. I then looked at the okay sequences in terms of how okay was being used in them. That is, I look to see where okay is located within the sequence and the turn, and what it is accomplishing in its environment. I identified 7 different environments for the particle okay in the conversations that I examined. And I'll take you through these briefly. We'll see examples of some of these environments in just a second. The first environment is okay in the first position of a sequence. Now, by the term sequence, I mean a series of turns that are structured around or organized around an initiating action and a responsive action. So something like a question-answer sequence. And okay appears in first position accompanying and initiating action. Okay can also appear in the second position of a sequence, that is, to implement a responsive action. Okay can appear in the third position of a sequence. In this case, it is dealing with the adequacy of the response that has just been given, and it is often proposing to close down the sequence. Okay can appear in sequence internal positions where it functions as a continuer. It can appear in turn initial positions where it marks a transition to a new topic or sequence. And it can appear in turn final position where it closes off prior talk and opens the way for transition to a new topic or sequence. And finally, okay appears in the pre-closing of a conversation. So these are the 7 environments that I identified. And what I did was, with the okay tokens that I had extracted from the 2 data sets, I assigned these tokens to one of the 7 categories and kept running a running record of the frequencies of okay in each of these categories. And I did this in both the older set of data and in the newer set of data. Then I was able to compare the uses of the tokens and their frequencies with one another in the older and the newer collections. And that gave me insight into how the use of okay has changed over the course of, from today, the last 60 years. So let's look at now what some of these significant changes are based on this comparative approach. And I'm going to start with okay in first position and talk about its probably one of its most basic uses, namely to accompany a directive turn. A directive turn is something like an offer, an invitation, a request, or a proposal, a suggestion. It's an action that attempts to get the other person to do something. And okay is often used as a follow-up to a directive turn. When this happens, it solicits acceptance or compliance with the directive. Often this happens when no response has been forthcoming. This use of okay accompanying a directive turn is found in both the older and the newer collections. And we can look at a first example now. This is an example from the older data. It's from a telephone conversation between Hyla and her friend Nancy. They're planning to go to the theater together in the evening. And Hyla now announces that they could go out for a drink.
Maybe we can go out for a drink tonight.
Yeah, that sounds, yeah, I owe you a drink.
I want to buy you a drink.
Oh, all right.
Okay, so we will for sure
right.
after the class.
Okay. Now, Nancy in line 3 announces that she owes Hyla a drink. And in line 5, she produces a turn that would seem to be inviting Hyla to have a drink. I want to buy you a drink. This would make expectable that Hyla would now either accept or reject the invitation. But what Hyla does here at the beginning of line 6 is to say, oh, that is neither an objection, neither a rejection nor an acceptance. And that is why Nancy now adds on in line 7, okay, which sounds like this.
Okay.
Okay. Pursuing a response to her invitation, I want to buy you a drink. In the meantime, Hyla has accepted the invitation by saying, all right, and she reiterates this acceptance here with all right. But what this example illustrates is this frequent use of okay to pursue a response to a directive when that response is not immediately forthcoming.
Okay.
Yeah, okay. Now we can go on to the next example. Okay, however, is also found as an accompaniment to an informing turn, that is not only to a directive turn, but also an informing turn. An informing turn is something like a piece of news that you deliver to the other person, a telling, something that you tell them that you think they should know, or an account for some type of behavior. Okay, when it accompanies an informing, solicits uptake and acknowledgement of the informing. This use of okay is found only in the newer data. And here is an example. It is from a face-to-face conversation. 4 women are sitting around a table having coffee and cake. One of the women is named Michelle. She works part-time as a waitress, and she's explaining to her friends, Donna and Laura, how to reckon a tip based on a bill that includes the sales tax. And in line 8, she introduces an example. Let's just say the bill is $20 total. And then she is going to explain how to figure out what the tip would be. To do that, she needs to reckon what the sales tax would be. At the time of this recording, the sales tax was 8%. So let's listen to this exchange.
I'm saying, okay, let's just say the bill is $20 total. Okay. And then taxes would be like what? 80 cents. Oh, how does that work? I'm really bad. $1.60. Whatever. Yeah, $1.60. Sounds good. These are not my specialty, okay? Mine either.
All right. So having introduced her example of a bill that is $20 total, Michelle tries to work out what 8% of $20 would be and suggests, first of all, in line 12, 80 cents. She then realizes that that's not right. And so she says, no, how does that work? And then comes up with $1.60. Laura is indulging here and says, whatever. Yeah, $1.60 sounds good. So Michelle is now in a position where she feels she needs to account for her error. And she does this by saying something that is slightly self-deprecatory. She says, well, percentages are not my specialty, and adds an okay to it. The okay sounds like this.
Okay.
Donna agrees, mine either. And then Michelle proceeds with her example. So what this excerpt shows is that we have here an account, percentages are not my specialty, that is informing the others of something. And Michelle doesn't wait for uptake from the others before pursuing a response. Instead, she adds okay immediately. It's latched on to the informing.
Okay.
Right. So what is new here is that okay is produced not in the absence of a response to an initiating turn, but it accompanies the initiating turn. It's latched onto the initiating turn. And it's located not in a directive sequence, but in an informative sequence. We could say that the sequence, this new use of okay tags, is not a sequence that is deontically driven. That is, it's not a sequence that has to do with obligation, telling the other person what they should do. But it's a type of sequence that is epistemically driven. That is, it's a type of sequence that deals with knowledge and the distribution of knowledge. Michelle is telling the others something she thinks they should know. And that is one of the new effects of one of the new uses of okay in the more recent set of data. Here are some raw frequencies. We can see that the use of a deontic tag has also increased. This is a tag that accompanies a directive. It's increased from the 1960s to the 1990s. But in the 1960s, there were no instances of a okay tag that accompanied an informing, whereas in the new data, there were 3 instances. All right, what about second position? How has okay changed here? Let's start with one of its common uses in the older data. This is as a response to a directive in a deontically driven sequence. When okay responds to a directive, a request, a proposal, an invitation, it signals acceptance or willingness to comply with the directive. This use is documented in both the older and the newer data. Here is a case from the newer data. It comes from a telephone conversation between Roberta and Liz, 2 friends. Roberta has just announced that she wants to send Liz a CD by the folk singer Susan Werner. And she asks Liz where she should send the CD so that it will be sure to reach her.
If you want to make sure, the best thing to do is just send it to the university. Otherwise, I got to go like all the way
why
to
don't I do that? Just
14th Street to pick it up.
Okay, so give me the address at the university.
Okay, it's Long Island University.
All right, well, I was interested in this example because of what happens in line 16 when Roberta asks Liz to give her the address at the university. She's proposing that that Roberta send the CD to the university, and now she's asking for the address at the university. And Liz signals compliance with this request by saying, okay, in line 19.
Okay.
And proceeds to give the address. So this is a very common way of using okay in the second position of a deontic sequence to respond to a request, offer, invitation, suggestion, so forth.
Okay.
Now, okay is also used, however, as a response to an informing, to an epistemically driven sequence. When this happens, it acknowledges the informing and the consequences that that informing has for the speaker. This use is also documented in both collections. but it's much more frequent in the newer collection, as we will see. But let's look at an example first. Here from the newer collection, a telephone conversation between Mom and her daughter, Sally. Mom has just announced to Sally that she will be going to New Jersey that evening to visit Grandpa.
But I wanted to call New Jersey while you're all down there, but I'll call in the morning then.
Okay, yeah. We'll go, I plan to take Grandpa to church tomorrow.
Okay.
So, you know, it wouldn't be early.
All right. Now, the interesting thing about this example is that Sally has announced her intention to call in the morning. I'll call in the morning then, she says in line 4. And Mom agrees with okay to this proposal. This is a deontic use of okay. But then what happens is Mom produces an informing. She delivers a piece of information to Sally. She says, I plan to take Grandpa to church tomorrow. Now, this is a piece of information that Mom clearly thinks Sally doesn't know, and she's informing her of it. But Sally doesn't respond as we might expect her to with, oh, indicating you've told me something that I didn't know before. She responds with, okay. And I think that we can see in this context why she says okay and not oh. It's because planning to take Grandpa to church tomorrow, as Mom says, she won't be there early in the morning, so Sally should not call early in the morning. In other words, Sally has recognized that this information has consequences for her plan to call Mom.
Okay.
There's her okay. So we can compare the use of okay here as a response to an informing. We can compare it with oh. O would convey, I now know something that I didn't know before, but it wouldn't indicate that there are consequences from this informing, consequences for the speaker's plans. Okay conveys, I get it and I understand the consequences. It implies that the information has consequences for the speaker. Okay. Now, if we look at second position okay and the frequency of the tokens, we can see that from the 60s to the 90s, the number of okay tokens in response to a deontic action, in response to a directive, they're relatively stable, the same number of tokens being used. But in response to informings, we have only few okay tokens used in the 60s, but 3 times as many almost in the 90s. So there is a significant increase here in the use of okay in second position in informing sequences. The frequency has increased significantly in epistemically driven sequences in second position. What about third position? Third position has been referred to by Shaglov as a sequence closing third. That is, it signals that the prior response is adequate and it proposes that the sequence can now be brought to a close. When okay is used in a directive to close a directive sequence, in a deontically driven sequence, it finalizes the prior turn, which is either acceptance or rejection of the directive, and it proposes to close down the sequence. This use is documented in both collections. We can see an example here from the same conversation that we had earlier of the 4 women sitting around a table having coffee and cake. Mom is now offering her guest, Donna, something to drink.
Would you like some more water or some hot tea or coffee?
I want some water and coffee.
Okay.
Is that being greedy?
No.
All right, so this is quite a straightforward offer here in line 1. Would you like some more water or some hot tea or coffee? Addressed to Donna. And Donna's response comes in line 4. I'll have some water and coffee. And Mom's sequence closing third. Okay. Dealing with that acceptance of her offer. We should be able to hear it.
Okay.
Okay. And she ultimately leaves for the kitchen to get the water. So this is a common use of okay in a deontically driven sequence where okay proposes to close down the sequence. But okay also appears in epistemically driven sequences. In this case, it acknowledges the information that has just been provided in the prior answer, and it accepts its consequences. This epistemic use of okay in third position is documented in both collections, but it's much more frequent in the newer data. Here is an example. This is from the same telephone conversation that we saw earlier between Mom and her daughter, Sally. Mom has just told Sally that she will be going down to New Jersey that afternoon to visit Grandpa.
Well, I thought I would. Are you spending the night in New Jersey then?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll go down later this evening. Holly and Bo.
Chris and I are going to be out tonight. Yeah, but I wanted to call New Jersey while you're all down there, but I'll call in the morning then.
All right. I left out some of the talk intervening, but I have put in the lines that are relevant for us to understand what's going on in this sequence. Sally elicits a piece of information from her mother in line 1, lines 1 and 2. Are you spending the night in New Jersey then? And Mom provides this information in line 3, yes. Sally receipts the information with okay. Okay. Now here too, we could ask, why does she not simply say, oh, she has been told something that she presumably didn't know before? Had she simply said, oh, she would have acknowledged that her state of information has now changed. It's been updated. She knows something now that she didn't know before. But she would not be acknowledging that this has consequences for her plans. And indeed, Sally does have a plan, which she kind of hints at in line 1 when she says, I thought I would, and then breaks off to ask for the information, are you spending the night? And then explains that she and her partner are going to be out that night. And finally, in lines 49 through 52, explains that I wanted to call New Jersey while you all are down there, but I'll call in the morning then. So that the information that Mom is spending the night in New Jersey has consequences for when Sally should make her call. So I think this provides nice evidence for the fact that there's a choice here between oh and okay, and okay is the choice that's made because the information that Sally has elicited is relevant as consequences for her own plans and agenda. Now, if we look at the frequencies of third position okay in the older and the newer data sets, we can see that the deontic use has dropped in frequency. I think that may be a fluke, which I can say more about in the discussion if you'd like. But what is more interesting is that the frequency of epistemic okay in third position has risen dramatically. Whereas there were only 5 tokens in the 60s, in the 90s, there were 34 tokens of okay being used this way. So there's been a veritable explosion of OK in the third position of epistemically driven sequences in the recent past. I'd like to zoom in now on the spread of epistemic OK and try to reflect a bit on how it might have come to spread so dramatically in epistemic, how OK has spread so dramatically in epistemic sequences. Here is a tabular summary of the frequencies again. And what you will see is that OK is now being used as a follow-up tag in epistemic sequences, whereas in the 60s it was not used that way at all. In the second position as a response, it's being used much more frequently as a response to an informing than in the 60s. And in third position as a sequence closing third in an informing sequence, it is exponentially more frequent. How can we account for this? It would seem to me that the second position use of OK is the key. If we remember that in second position, OK in an epistemic sequence implies that there are consequences that derive from the information that has just been imparted, then it's kind of easy to see how this consequential meaning can transfer when OK is attached to a first position informative action. When this happens, it always has rising intonation. And what it is doing is implying that there are consequences attached to the information that is being given, and it provides an opportunity for the recipient to acknowledge these consequences. Now, what about third position OK? How should we think of the dramatic increase in OK in third position? We can start by recalling that in the older data, the OK in third position of an epistemic sequence always implies that the information has consequences for the speaker or some project of the speakers. In the newer data, however, it only has this meaning in 1/3 of the cases. That is, there is another third of cases in the newer data where the information that is being imparted is a correction or a counter-informing. And OK is used to close down this counter-informing or corrective sequence. So here is a case in point. This is from a telephone conversation. This is from a telephone conversation between Annabelle and Renata. Annabelle has asked Renata when a mutual friend of theirs is getting married. Basically, she's wondering if she will have another wedding to go to that summer. But Renata replies that the wedding won't be for a while. And then Renata goes on with this.
Didn't seem like there was any rush, but we're all bridesmaids.
We are?
As far as I know.
Oh, I'm not.
You're not?
I doubt it.
Okay. Well, you're coming anyway.
All right. So this is what I would call a counter-informing sequence. Renata is under the impression that she and Annabelle will be bridesmaids in this upcoming wedding, but Annabelle, based on her epistemic authority, says, I'm not a bridesmaid, as far as I know. And Renata must stand corrected. And she indicates this by saying, okay. Let's listen to her, okay.
Okay.
Okay. So she is, by producing okay here, she is acknowledging the counter-informing, the correction that Annabelle has just produced, and suggesting, perhaps we could say, that it has consequences for her beliefs and assumptions. So we might say that in a third position, a counter-informing sequence, an okay implies that there's a consequence for the speaker's beliefs and assumptions. Okay is roughly implying I now stand corrected. And interestingly, this use is much more frequent in the newer data compared to the older data. So this is one explanation for why and how epistemic okay has increased in frequency in third position. But there's a final third of cases in the newer data where okay follows an informing in third position that is neither consequential nor corrective for the person who has solicited it. And here is a case in point. This is from the same four-way face-to-face conversation, the women sitting around a table having coffee and cake. Mom and Laura have been talking about Weight Watchers and the recommendations that their advisor gives them there. Their guest, Donna, now wants to know more.
Where do you go for that, Weight Watchers?
Behind Safeway it's actually at an old folks home in their like recreation center thing. Yeah.
All right, so Donna has elicited a piece of information here in line 1. Where do you go for that? Weight Watchers, line 4. And Mom replies at behind Safeway, and it's actually an old folks home in their like recreation center. Now, that is the response to Donna's question. And Donna receipts this, acknowledges this response by saying, okay, in line 11. Let's listen to that.
Okay.
Okay. That is, she is receiving a piece of information that she has solicited. But what's interesting about this instance is that the information is not consequential for Donna. She has no plans to go to Weight Watchers herself. In fact, she's very athletic. She jogs. She doesn't need to go to Weight Watchers. And there's no indication in the data that she's intending to go or intending to recommend it to other people to go. Nor is there any indication in the data that she believes that it's located somewhere else. So this information is not correcting any assumption on Donna's part. This is a use of okay to respond to a piece of information that is neither consequential nor corrective of the speaker's beliefs. And it is a use that is not documented in the older data. So what we've seen is an example of okay used to receive a non-consequential, non-corrective piece of information that has been solicited. This use is not documented in earlier data. And in fact, if you go back to the earlier data and look for similar sequential environments, you'll always find O being used to close down such sequences. So it looks as if okay has now replaced O in the third position of these informing sequences where the information is not consequential or corrective. Now let me come back to the Interactional Linguistics program. First, summarizing the development of okay. What I have presented today, I've talked about okay in first position and said that and shown that it is now produced not only in the absence of a response to an initiating turn that's a directive, but it's increasingly latched onto an initiating turn that is informative. The example that I showed was this one, where Michelle says, well, percentages are not my specialty, okay? That is a new use. In second position, the frequency of okay has increased in epistemic sequences, where it conveys that the information has consequences for the speaker. And the example that we saw here was Mom telling Sally, I plan to take Grandpa to church tomorrow, and Sally responding with, okay. This has become much more frequent, this use of okay. And in third position, I've shown that there's been an explosion in the frequency of epistemic okay, due first of all to its increased use in acknowledging corrections and counter-informings. That was this example, where Renata claims we're all bridesmaids, and Annabelle says, I'm not. And Renata then says, okay. And its new use in acknowledging a piece of information that is solicited, but is not corrective or consequential for the speaker. And this was the example where Donna asks about Weight Watchers, where do you go for that? And Mom replies at behind Safeway, and Donna receipts this information with okay. This information being non-corrective and non-consequential for any project that Donna might have. This is a new use, and I think it's partially responsible for the increased frequency of okay in third position epistemic sequences. There are other developments of okay in other sequential and turn positions, but I haven't had time to talk about them today. Okay is increasingly being used as a continua, for instance, but I'll save that for another occasion. Let's reflect finally about the approach that I've taken. I have singled out comparable sequential environments in data from two different points in time, the 60s and the 90s to 2000, roughly 30 years, that is a little bit more than 30 years, roughly a generation between these 2 points in time. And I have looked at the resources used in these sequential environments and compared them from one data set to the other. Which resources are used for which purposes and how frequently are they used? Now, in a recent article on question-answer sequences, Stivers has said that sequential slots, and she's talking about answers to polar questions, can be thought of as having conceptual possibility spaces that are oriented to when participants choose which resources to use and how to interpret the choices made there. What she means is that the sequential slot created by a polar question where the answer should occur has a number of resources that can be used there that create a possibility space. Now, what I'm suggesting is that we can think of these sequential slots, first position, second position, third position, and their possibility spaces in different sequence types. We can compare these over time in different data sets from different points in time to identify new practices and shifts in practices for the conduct of conversation. Such a comparison of interactional practices over time is really only feasible on a short-term basis. But even within one generation, changes are not uncommon. And an interactional linguistic approach can uncover these changes. With wide applications, for instance, wherever longitudinal interactional data are available, first language acquisition, second language acquisition, psychotherapy, we can make observations and draw conclusions about the way language is being used at different points in time. So this is what I mean by the chance of interactional linguistics. We can draw attention to how linguistic resources are deployed in specific interactional tasks at different periods in time. And this can furnish us a basis for claims about language change, including how language is learned and how interactional competence is acquired. That's it. Thank you. And I will flash up my references briefly. I'm just going to put them up here so that if you want to come back later and check any of these references, you can do so. And now I'll end my show. Good, Stein, I want to stop sharing the screen and give the floor over to Esther, who I believe will coordinate the questions.
Okay, thank you very much for this lovely talk. And I was very impressed by the speed with which changes and diachronic data comes about. We never stop and see more with more depth about the interactional data, because we tend to take interaction as natural. It's so natural. We really tend to naturalize those.
That's right. I should say, if I can add something there, this is a change that I have observed in my own lifetime. I grew up in the States, and I was familiar with the way OK was used then. And now that I am exposed to recent speakers using OK, I have become aware that there is this new use of OK.
Yeah, I have noticed that in Britain as well. They call it some. I have the impression this nonchalant use. It wasn't there. I mean, 40 years ago.
Yes.
Yes. Right. We have some questions. I mean, we have one, quite a long question by Uwe Alexander Kuttner.
Yes.
Who says it's a lovely talk, and I thought so too. Let me find the first one. Yeah, I struggle a bit with seeing an announcement of a plan, such as, I want to buy you a drink.
Yes.
As a directive action and a self-deprecatory assessment of an informing. That's sorry, that's the beginning of the question is.
Yeah.
Could you tell us a little more about how she classified the action as, for example, directive versus informing in the first positioned actions? And the continuation for this question is that I struggle a bit with seeing an announcement of a plan, such as I want to buy you a drink as a directive action and a self-deprecatory assessment of an informant. That's fine.
Good. Okay. Yeah. So at one very superficial level, I want to buy you a drink is, of course, an informing. It's telling the recipient something that she presumably doesn't know or didn't know before. But at a deeper level, it is basically saying, let me pay for the drink. And that is what I am seeing as directive. This very subtle suggestion, I'm going to be the one paying. And for that reason, I was suggesting that this is in the category of offer or invitation, which is kind of imposing on the other person, hinting strongly at what they should do.
And Uwe Alexander Kuttner has another question. It's curious. Well, he thinks that the bridesmaid example is a great example, and I think so too. It's very funny.
Which example? Oh, the bridesmaid, yes.
The bridesmaid, yeah.
That's right.
He has another question. It's curious that these third position uses tend to have level intonation. So would they also not contextualize possible sequence closure anymore?
Okay. Well, it does have a very special intonation, this okay. It has what I would call a stylized intonation. I believe she said something like okay, and level, ending in level. And so that it's a complex action that has a number of different layers. But at one very basic level, I see it as suggesting you have, on the basis of your epistemic authority, have corrected me. You clearly know better, and if you say so, I'm going to accept it. And she then goes on to say, if I remember correctly, something like, something that suggests we can close down the topic about, well, I'd have to go back. Well, let's see, I go back to what she says. Yeah, I'm interested to see what she says next. Here it is. Well, you're coming anyway, she goes on to say. Okay, well, you're coming anyway. And so this is kind of a way to bring to a close the issue of who's going to be the bridesmaid or not. And it's moving on to, well, you'll be coming to the wedding anyway. And for that reason, I think that at one very basic level, it is proposing provisional sequence closing. But it's true that the intonation is complex and adding a layer of meaning that would be very interesting to analyze further.
And I don't know how to pronounce Xiaoting.
Yes.
Wonder if you could speak more about the prosodic patterns, if any, of OKs in different sequential environments?
Yes. Yes. Now that's something that I didn't say much about, although you could hear from the examples that I was playing that they were varied. And it's in the OK volume, the chapter that I wrote deals with the prosody of OK in American English, and it talks about the various patterns that are encountered in these different sequential environments. But there are some patterns that are quite binding in that if OK is being used as a tag, it will tend to have rising intonation. So, OK, I want to buy you a drink, OK? Or percentages are not my specialty, OK? That type of rise is found on OK tags. Sequence closing OKs are varied, as we saw, and they can have affective stances overlaid on them, such that you almost have to, it's difficult to identify any binding patterns. But when you get into the use of OK as a continuer, you find that it is often low-pitched and soft volume OK, often with slightly rising or level pitch OK. And the OKs in pre-closings also have very characteristic patterns. Yeah, I would simply refer Zhao Ting perhaps to this chapter that's coming out in the OK volume, where I go into these patterns more in detail.
Right. We have a question from Cecilia Rojas Nieto from Mexico. Which relation OK has with the items formerly used in the positions OK is adopting? can we say there has been a sort of replacement, or there is still a competition?
Okay.
It's very
all right. Yes. So that is one of the things that I think is really very interesting. Now, in some of these responsive positions, I feel that, as I tried to show, there is a contrast. So we might say a competition maybe between the use of O and the use of OK. So O will have one set of implications and OK will have another set. And these are not interchangeable. But when we get to the use of OK in third position to deal with a non-consequential, non-corrective piece of information that's been solicited, the example with where do you go for that behind Safeway, OK, that use of OK is, I think the speaker could very easily have said O at that point. And it wouldn't have made, I wouldn't have seen any major difference in implication there. And as this was the case where if you go back to earlier data and look for similar sequential environments, you always find O being used. So this would be a case where I think that we might say that OK is beginning to replace O.
So it may be a generation.
Yes, that's right. Yes, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay. And Cecilia says also that I think we can have parallel changes in Spanish. For example, aha. I don't know about that.
That would be very interesting if I mean, clearly these types of changes take place in other languages as well. And it may not affect OK, but it may affect other response particles. Yes.
Right, I think, okay, we have, this is all, I think.
Uh-huh.
Oh, there's another one here, sorry. Uh-huh. Lucas Sweden.
Yeah.
Okay, can we make claims about changes in frequency of certain practices given potential unknown biases in data collection, particularly for secondary analysis and without statistical tools?
Okay, so yes, so clearly these frequencies are raw frequencies, and they were based on manual collection of examples. And I was basically suggesting that they indicate they are indicative of changes. If one were so inclined, then it might be possible to set up a much larger scale semi-automatic survey, a corpus linguistic survey of OK and its sequential environments, and to try to determine whether these changes are borne out by statistical analysis. But I do see a problem there in that at the moment, I think this categorization of, in particular, the OK in epistemic sequences, whether it is, whether the information provided is consequential or not, whether I see that as being a very subtle factor that requires context-sensitive examination of the surroundings. And I'm not sure that that type of analysis could be done in a semi-automatic way. So I don't know to what extent this type of study could be automated such that you would have large enough numbers and in order to be able to make statistical predictions or even statistical claims. So I would leave that perhaps for younger scholars who are interested perhaps in trying to work out to what extent a study like this that is indicative based on microanalysis, to what extent that can be expanded on and extended to a larger scale such that it would be possible to have statistical analyses.
Yes, absolutely, yeah. So thank you very, very much, Elizabeth. Mm-hmm. That's been a lovely talk, and the people really liked it. You're going to see the chat afterwards.
All right.
And I want to know if you want to address to the audience now and say your last words.
Oh, well, I haven't planned any last words, except that I'm very grateful to Abralin Vivo for having me, for giving me this opportunity to talk about my research. And I'm very grateful to the audience for their questions and for their interest. So I can only say, you know, you're going in the right direction, and I think this is an excellent initiative. And the French would say bonne continuation. Continue along this way.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for your attention here this afternoon. And we still have the rest of today, and tomorrow we're going to have a kind of a closing session or ceremony that will put together the presidents of the association and societies that co-sponsor Abralin ao Vivo. Now I'm saying this in Portuguese. Muito obrigada pela atenção e, por favor, continuem. Hoje nós temos umas excelentes palestras, inclusive do Rodolfo Hilari, daqui a pouco. E, por favor, voltem aqui amanhã às 14h com uma sessão de encerramento de Abralin ao Vivo. And thank you very much. That's it.
All right.
And thank you, Miguel, for inviting me to mediate this session.
We are all grateful to Miguel for having organized.
Yes,
Absolutely.
It's fantastic series. Okay.